Hello, and welcome back to The Complete Pilgrim. Today, I'm going to be talking about synagogues. Old synagogues. Really, really old synagogues. So where exactly is the world's oldest synagogue? If you do an internet search for the term world's oldest synagogue, you might get one of several answers. The most likely result will be the Star Nova Synagogue in the city of Prague. But you might also get the Delos Synagogue in Greece, the El Ghriba Synagogue in Tunisia, the Ancient Synagogue in Barcelona, Spain, or the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo, Egypt. You might even get something else entirely. So which one of these synagogues, if any, can truly lay claim to being the world's oldest? Let's start with a very brief overview on the origins of synagogues. Synagogues as an institution have been around for well over 2,000 years. Archaeological research has discovered synagogues built as early as the 2nd century BCE, but there were almost certainly some that were around before this. Synagogues proliferated across the Mediterranean world as Jews migrated throughout the Roman Empire. The numbers and importance of synagogues grew significantly after the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 CE. At the height of Rome's power and territorial expanse, there were probably hundreds of synagogues scattered throughout the empire. They could be found in almost every major city, especially in the east. Sadly, most of these were lost to natural disasters, wars, demolitions, and the neglect that comes with the march of time. However, a surprising number of synagogue ruins from the Roman era still exist. Which brings us to a major question. When it comes to determining which synagogue is the oldest, what exactly are the criteria? When it comes to assessing synagogue ages, consider the following. First, what is the state of the structure? Is the synagogue as originally built still essentially intact? Has it been substantially reconstructed over time? Or is it little more than a ruin? Second, what is its status as a synagogue? Was the building originally constructed as a synagogue or as something else? Has it been in use as a synagogue for the majority of its existence? Is it even still in use? Based on these criteria, I have divided my search for the world's oldest synagogue into 5 categories. Number 1, the synagogue is a ruin and exists primarily as an archaeological site. Number 2, the synagogue is an intact building, however with minimal, if any, original surviving structural elements. Number 3, the synagogue is an intact building with a substantial amount of original surviving structural elements. However, it was not purpose-built as a synagogue. Number 4, the synagogue is an intact building with a substantial amount of original surviving structural elements. However, it is not currently in use as a synagogue. And number 5, the synagogue is an intact building with a substantial amount of original surviving structural elements and is currently in use as a synagogue. Let's start with ruins. If ruins are eligible for consideration, then the oldest known synagogue in the world is possibly the Delos Synagogue on the island of Delos in Greece. Dated to the 2nd century BCE, there is debate among academics as to whether or not this was in fact a synagogue or a private home. There is also a possibility that the building was a Samaritan rather than a Jewish structure. Both of these circumstances would likely disqualify the ruin as a synagogue, but there are other candidates. The ruins of Modi'in Synagogue in Israel and the Stobi Synagogue in North Macedonia have both been dated to the 2nd century BCE as well. The latter is noteworthy for its engraving indicating that the building was financed by one Polycarmos, the earliest patron of a specific synagogue known by name. The Holy Land is dotted with the ruins of synagogues dating to the 1st century BCE, including those at Magdala, Jericho, Herodium, and Masada. The construction of the latter two are attributed to Herod the Great. Other ancient synagogue ruins of note, including the Ostia Synagogue outside of Rome, the Dura Europa Synagogue in eastern Syria, and the Sardis Synagogue in Turkey, all of which date to the Roman imperial era. Next, I'm going to take a bit of a shortcut and combine 2 categories: synagogues that have relatively little left of their original structure, and synagogues that were not purpose-built. There are 4 synagogues that fall into these categories, and each one of them has a fascinating story. The first is the ancient Synagogue of Barcelona. Originally constructed in the early 4th century CE, this would be the oldest synagogue in Western Europe. However, the building was almost certainly not a purpose-built synagogue, and probably did not come into use as such until the Middle Ages. Moreover, much of the building dates from a later reconstruction in the 13th century. Jewish worship probably ended here in the 15th century, when Spain's Jews were forced to convert or leave the country. The El Ghriba Synagogue in Tunisia is said to have been founded in the 6th century BCE. While this is highly unlikely, it is not impossible. Thanks to their close relations with the Phoenicians, it is possible that Israelite communities might have been established in and around Carthage in what is now Tunisia before the Babylonian conquest of Judah. According to tradition, an altar stone, saved from the destruction of Solomon's temple, is incorporated into the building structure. However, most of the current synagogue dates from a reconstruction in the 19th century. The Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo was originally constructed in the 9th century. It was a major center of Jewish learning in the Middle Ages, with scholars such as Moses Maimonides spending time here. The synagogue became famous in the 19th century for its geniza, a storage room where thousands of Jewish documents, some dating back almost 1,000 years, were discovered. Much of the current synagogue dates from a reconstruction in the late 19th century. The Rashi Shul Synagogue in the city of Worms was originally constructed in 1034 and was possibly the first synagogue in Germany. It was in Worms and other Rhineland cities that the first Ashkenazi Jewish communities were formed. However, the synagogue did not fare well. It was destroyed twice, once by Crusaders in the Middle Ages, and again by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Most of the current synagogue dates from a reconstruction in the 20th century. Now we get to what I think are the top candidates. The following synagogue buildings are all intact. However, not all are currently in use as synagogues. Working backwards, we'll start with the Staronova Synagogue in Prague. The Staronova Synagogue, or Old New Synagogue, was completed in 1270. It is often cited as being the oldest synagogue in the world. However, it is more accurate to say that it is the oldest continually active synagogue in the world, or nearly so. The synagogue has been in almost continuous use as a synagogue for over 7.5 centuries, with only some brief interruptions, including during World War II. The Staronova Synagogue is the centerpiece of Europe's best preserved medieval Jewish neighborhood. The Old Synagogue in Erfurt, Germany, also dates back to the 13th century. However, the Jewish community of Erfurt was massacred in 1349, and the synagogue was sold. For 6 centuries, it was put to other uses, including as a warehouse, and over time it was completely forgotten that the building was in fact a synagogue. Its origin was so forgotten that even the Nazis left the building alone. Finally recognized in the post-war era, the synagogue has since been renovated and is now in use as a museum. The Scolanova Synagogue in Trani, Italy, was completed sometime around the early 13th century. It remained in use as a synagogue for over 300 years before being confiscated by the Roman Catholic Church in the 16th century. It was then reconsecrated as a church, which it remained until the mid-20th century. It was finally returned to the Jewish community in 2005, roughly 800 years after its original construction. There are a number of very old synagogues in Spain that date back to the Middle Ages, including some built in the 12th century. These are mostly found in places like Córdoba, Seville, and Toledo, with the most famous being the Ibn Shushan Synagogue in Toledo. Almost all of Spain's synagogues were confiscated in the 15th century and then destroyed, repurposed, or reconsecrated as churches. Some of these have since been returned, and those that have are now mostly run as museums. Returning to the Holy Land, the oldest intact synagogue in Israel is the Karaite Synagogue in Jerusalem. Originally built in the 9th century, it was reconstructed in the 12th century. Somehow, it has largely survived dozens of wars, sieges, and conquests, including the flattening of the Jewish quarter by artillery during the Israeli War of Independence. The original building is so old that much of it is now below street level. Before I get to the world's oldest intact synagogue, let me talk about 2 honorable mentions. First is Jerusalem's famous Western Wall. Constructed as a retaining wall for the Temple Mount in the 1st century BCE, the Western Wall is now the most sacred place in the Jewish tradition. Today it is recognized and treated as an open-air synagogue. In theory, the Western Wall would be one of the world's oldest synagogues. The second honorable mention is, or rather was, the Synagogue of Thessaloniki in Greece. The Jewish quarter of Thessaloniki, or Thessalonica, was among the oldest in Europe. Its synagogue probably dated to the 1st century BCE and was still standing 2,000 years later. Sadly, this ancient synagogue was destroyed in a fire in 1917 that swept through much of the city. For those interested in Christian history, this synagogue was almost certainly visited by Paul, making it the last known surviving structure that could be directly tied to events in the New Testament. The Jewish community of Lebanon is one of the oldest in the world. It dates at least as far back as the 8th century BCE, when the Israelites of the northern kingdom interacted with the people of Phoenicia in the cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon. The latter city is home to a synagogue that was completed in the early 9th century. It stands on the site of an even earlier synagogue. 1,200 years later, the Sidon synagogue is still mostly intact. The Jewish community of Sidon, which survived for nearly 3,000 years, sadly departed in the 1970s. Nevertheless, the synagogue is still standing, and at the time of this writing was being looked after by a Muslim family. So in answer to the question of where is the world's oldest synagogue, I would say that the title goes to the Sidon Synagogue in Lebanon. For the oldest intact synagogue in continual use, I would agree with the Staronova Synagogue in Prague. For more information on these synagogues, as well as hundreds of other places of Jewish interest, please check out my book, The Complete Jewish Pilgrim, a guide to 200 of the world's most sacred, historic, tragic, and triumphant places of Jewish interest. For more information on religious travel and pilgrimage, please visit my website at thecompletepilgrim.com. I also have several travel books available on Amazon: The Complete American Pilgrim, The Complete American Military Pilgrim, The Complete Jewish Pilgrim, and the award-winning The Complete Christian Pilgrim. These links can be found in the description.